Alright, so this is going to be my game that I played yesterday morning. So we'll go ahead and flip the board here. So this was an over-the-board game. My Saturday morning game, I play every Saturday morning with the local chess club. And this was actually round 3 of the tournament. In the first round, I beat an unrated player. Second round, I played one of the top seeds and lost in an interesting game that I might make a video about later. But this game, I was facing Mark Morelli, and he was white, and he's in the mid 1700s. Sometimes he plays a lot stronger than that, sometimes he doesn't. So he's not very consistent, and so I wasn't sure what I was going to see exactly, but I didn't want to play to his strengths. So I'll talk about that in a minute. I am rated around 1900, mid 1800s. So I was higher rated, but not by enough that it mattered a ton. And so he started by playing e4, and I play the French, so I played e6. He played d4, and I played d5, and he's been playing knight c3 going into the win hour, which is what I play from the black and white side. And so we've probably, in blitz games, and quick games, casual games, we've probably played a dozen of these win hours in the last 2 weeks. So just against each other, we've had a lot of experience recently in these lines. And so I had to decide what I wanted to go into. So we'll continue. It's the main moves. E5, C5, A3. I exchange. And he played the sharpest, what's considered the best continuation, which is queen g4. Attacking this pawn here, and I have to decide what I want to do. I've got a few options. What black's sharpest reply is to play queen c7. And what happens is you give up. Whoops, we flipped the board somehow. You give up the g-pawn and the h-pawn for a lot of activity on the queen side in targeting these weaknesses. And I'll probably make a video at some other point going into those lines specifically, but today I'm just going to focus on this game. So the critical moves here are queen c7, or I can castle kingside, or a really interesting move is simply playing king f8. Now, with both king f8 and castling kingside, basically black's plan is to survive white's kingside attack and then play from there. With queen c7, black's basically letting white do what they want and giving up a pawn, and black's going to do what they want on the queen side. So you basically have both sides being very aggressive and getting a lot of play, and it's just all out. It's one of the sharpest openings in chess, really. That's also relatively solid for both sides. But I usually play queen c7, and I knew that Mark has been looking into this line. So I decided to play something out of the book that I knew wasn't the best, but that doesn't always matter. Chess isn't always about playing the best move, and maybe people will disagree with me there, but it's about posing problems for your opponent. So I actually went ahead and I played knight g6. Played knight g6 right away. And this isn't the best move for black, because black usually wants to wait to decide where they want to commit that knight. But if white doesn't play precisely, black can get a really nice game out of it, as we're going to see. So white obviously has a few options they can develop normally. The bishop or the knight, or they even have this bishop move coming to g5, which isn't as good as it looks because my queen simply goes over to the king side and targets these weaknesses anyway, which is where the queen often wants to go. So I wasn't worried about that. And if he develops slowly with the knight or the bishop, then I'm simply going to get a fine game, a normal game, probably equality without too much of a problem. So he plays h4, and h4 is probably the best move here. And I've got to decide exactly how I'm going to handle this. and I decided that I was going to contest it immediately with h5. Now the reason I did this is because I looked and I didn't see any great places for the queen. See, if the queen moves away from this pawn, white has to worry about black taking that pawn at some point. If the queen steps back, now the queen is moved a second time, and I can start arranging c4 and then develop to castle on the queen side and get my king safe that way because I've weakened this. And so I'm creating a weakness on h5, maybe other weaknesses on the king side, but I don't plan on the king sticking around if he's going to keep the pressure over there. So if he keeps the pressure on, then I think I can get my king safe on the queen side. His other option is to play queen g5 and force the queens off. And this was the option I expected him to choose. And I don't think it's a great option for white. I think it looks better than it is, as we'll end up talking about. So this is what he plays, queen g5, and I like this because I went ahead and took the queen, and he took with the bishop. And it looks okay because he's developed his bishop out, and the bishop looks strong, it's got an outpost, but it really doesn't have any targets, and so I wasn't worried about the bishop. In addition, at this point, the most important minor piece is really going to be this knight here, as we're going to find out. And white's pieces don't have great targets. One plan is that he might be able to get this knight out at some point to help target this pawn here. Maybe that's an idea for him at some point. But right now I don't think white has a clear plan, and black's plan is pretty clear. I'm going to get my king safe, and then I'm going to use this knight to target the queenside weaknesses. So black's plan is very clear, and white really has to come up with a plan. So black's plan is the same here as it is in almost every other win-hour French, and white's plan is very different. So if nothing else, I get an advantage in that regard. In addition, at this point, I think that black basically has equality or close to it. There are no weaknesses that white has that or black has that white doesn't really have an equivalent to. This knight, if he ever brings the bishop out, as we'll see, doubling those pawns really isn't as good as it looks. Again, just like this bishop, white's position ends up looking better than it is, because the bishop pair that white has is hard to use. So after the bishop takes, I go bishop d7. Now I said this knight was the most important, and you might think I wanted to develop it immediately, but if I did that, then his bishop would have aspirations of probably pinning my knight, because in this kind of position at this point, his light squared bishop, even though it's his good bishop, would probably be fine with trading for my good knight, since I've already given up my good bishop, and his other bishop has potential to be good. So he follows the expected plan, bishop d3, which is where you kind of expect the white bishop to go. So he's trying to follow the typical win-hour plans for white. And I had the choice of c4, which I don't think is good, because he's likely to take this knight anyway. So there's no reason for me to throw that in there. So he moves there, and I've got to decide what to do with this knight. Do I move it? Do I leave it there? And as I said before, I thought that him doubling my g-pawns really wasn't a problem. And so the bishop goes to d3, and I'm simply going to develop my strong knight. Notice that this pawn, taking the c5 pawn, really is never a threat, because these triple isolated pawns end up so weak, and it's really black, the one that's going to be able to target them so quickly, by getting the rook to the c file, by moving the knight over to a5. So I'm not really worried about black ever taking on c5. So he immediately takes the knight. And even if taking the knight is his plan, there's probably no reason to do it immediately. He'd probably just wait. It's not like my knight has anywhere else it's going to go. But he took it right away, and I took, and I figured if I castle, now I'm going to use this open f-file. So I don't know why my arrows aren't working now, but I'm going to be able to open this f-file and get the rook on it just by castling, and my king's going to end up pretty safe. There's not a way to target it, especially without queens on the board. Now without the light squared bishop, this g6 pawn really isn't that weak either. So he goes knight e2, with the idea of getting it to f4 and then maybe target h5 at some point. But he overlooked that I have a pretty simple defense to help guard these weak pawns. So I castle, and now I've got the f file, and I expect to get the c file. So I know both my rooks are going to be active and they're going to be strong, and both of his rooks aren't really doing much. I thought one option he might have at some point of the game, instead of kingside castling, might be to just do a rook lift up to h3 with his rook, but that didn't really happen because he immediately castled also. And so his rook on the f file really isn't doing much. So I go ahead and take on c4, or on d4 with my c pawn, because I want to use this open c file to my advantage. Now you can't take with the knight, because I'm going to immediately take the e5 pawn. So I'm undoubling his pawns, but it's not a big deal, because doubled c pawns for white often aren't a huge weakness, and in this case his c pawn becomes weaker because it can now be targeted directly, because I can now use the c file. I'm also eyeing that c4 square from my knight, and there's not really much you can do about it, so knight a5. And at this point, I think that white's really fighting for equality for the most part. I mean, maybe the computer disagrees, but for practical purposes, black has achieved everything they want. They have two open files for the rook, they have an active knight, they're going to get an outpost, and white still hasn't achieved what they want. There are really no targets to take advantage of, and the white knight really doesn't have much of a future. It doesn't have any good squares to go to. Even if the white knight gets several moves in a row, it can't really infiltrate to help with any kind of attacks. I think that one idea that white should have played probably was to try and take the b file even earlier than this, get that rook on b1 as soon as possible, to try and get some counterplay on the queen side. As it is, he moves knight f4, and he just simply overlooked that king h7 keeps my king safe and helps really guard the king side, and the knight now has no targets. But the knight go ahead and jumps to d3, which looks nice. You know, you hit here with tempo, you jump it back, now you're eyeing the c5 square, but I can simply play b6, and now there's no play on the b file, and this knight doesn't have any squares to go to. And he plays the knight back to b2 to try and prevent my knight from coming into c4. And I'm going to go ahead and take the c file, and he's going to go ahead and move this rook over. Now at first I thought that maybe he should have played the a rook over, but that doesn't really work because I'm able to get my rook into c3 and target that a3 pawn, and there's really nothing he can do about it. So he had to leave the a rook there and bring the f rook over. And you'll notice that this weakens the b3 square in the sense that now if the knight's ever able to get there or the c pawn moves, I'm going to have some forks. So I'm going to go ahead and threaten to double up, and he plays his bishop back to d2. And I bring my knight back to c6 in order to target his d4 square. So at this point, my opponent has used a little over half an hour of the game, a little more than that. And yeah, he's used about 40 minutes, and I've used only about 10 or 15 minutes. So all of this is kind of in the ideas I already had prepared. White's the one trying to make all the decisions in this game. I'm still following the basic plans that I play in every French game almost, so I'm not having to make hard decisions at this point. Which is nice because it's white fighting for equality, and he ends up coming up with a creative way to kind of achieve that equality, but black's never really in any danger. And so he plays the bishop here. If he had pushed c3, then the knight would come back and just have a lot of threats because that b3 square was so weak. So the bishop comes back to e3. So now the bishop is basically acting as a pawn. His knight's in a passive position. And so I simply doubled up my rooks. And I kind of underestimated his reply because as soon as I double up, he can actually get this nice pawn break in c4. And I underestimated it is because whenever I looked and I take, I assumed that he was going to take with the knight. But that doesn't really work because my knight takes here. And I'm going to end up better. But he can take with the rook, which is what he did, which was creative. And a nice try by him. And he's going to force the rooks off the board. And we're essentially going to go into a pretty equal endgame. So I take, rook takes, my knight really has to go to a5. He's going to exchange. He's going to play his rook over. And then here I'm kind of forced to exchange. Now, in this position, white's minor pieces are pretty passive. And my minor pieces are pretty good. I've got this 2-on-1 majority on the queen side. My knight's kind of holding his pieces at bay. My bishop's going to be able to improve. In addition, I think my king is likely to become better. I had a lot of ideas where I simply pushed this g-pawn, sacrificing it, allowing my king to just walk in. And that threat, I think, made my play in the center and on both sides of the board enough that it's hard for white to defend. So this position's probably equal with best play, but it's still white the one that has to struggle here. So I'm going to move bishop b5. So this helps cut off his knight and cuts off his king. Improves my bishop. My bishop doesn't really have to guard this e6 pawn because there's really not much he can do to get at it. So bishop d2. So he hits my knight, but my knight gets to hit back with tempo. And really, he probably should have just moved to e3 to begin with, since I'm hitting the bishop and the pawn. But by going here first and getting my knight to move, it opens up the option of bishop c3, which looks like an improvement for white. So go ahead and take a moment here and see if you can find the move for black that really seals the deal, wins the game. So feel free to pause the video if you need to. I'll give you another couple seconds, and then I'm going to move on. Alright, so initially, this move, bishop c3, looks pretty strong. It helps keep my knight in. My knight can't move to this square. It can't move to this square. It can't take the pawn. It can't move here. It can move to the corner, which really isn't that great. And so suddenly it looks like black's knight may not be that great. But the move knight c1 is actually really strong because of the threat of it going to e2 with check. And there's really not much that white can do about it. So if the king moves away, I still move the knight to e2, and I'm going to win the pawn when the bishop moves. Like, for example, let's say the king here, knight here, and if he tries to guard with the knight, I simply attack the knight. And once the knight gets saved, then I can take the bishop. For that same reason, the knight coming back to guard the bishop doesn't work, because, again, I attack the knight, and then I'm going to attack the bishop. So just removing that defender. So I think that he found the kind of the best chance that white has here, which is just to attack my bishop right off the bat. And with the idea that once I get his bishop, he's going to get my bishop. What doesn't quite work out is that once I take his bishop, I'm actually guarding, or I'm actually attacking this square, and so I'm going to pick up the pawn. So this tactic wins an important pawn in an endgame. So I go check, and I believe that his king went to, make sure I get this right, his king went to h2, just so it's a little bit easier for that king to get out and into the game later. And I went ahead and took the bishop. So at this point, he had about 49 minutes on his clock, and I had 83 on mine. We started with 90 minutes with 30-second increment each. And so you can see that he used a lot more time just overall in this game. And so now the game kind of speeds up because we're in the end game. So he's forced to take my bishop, and I take here. And then I thought that the best move for white here was probably just to push this pawn. And then we both get past pawns. And it's still losing, without a doubt, for white. But he instead played knight d3 and just kind of gave up that pawn. So now I still have these passed pawns either way. But he doesn't really have the threat of anything to kind of counterattack with. So I'm going to be pushing on the queen side, and he doesn't really have a way to break through on the king side. So knight takes d4. And he's going to go knight g3, king g3. Make sure I get these moves right. Yeah, king g3. I'm going to move king g8. He's going to move knight f4. I'm going to move king he goes knight f. Yeah, he goes knight f4. And I'm going to go king f7. I'm going to go, what does he play here? We got our notation a little bit confused. Let's go back a couple moves to knight takes d4. To knight takes bishop, a takes bishop, knight takes b, knight d3, knight takes d4, and oh, okay, so here he went knight f4, it looks like. Is that what he did? Yeah. That's not what he did. That doesn't make sense. So it looks like my notation got a little bit messed up here, as sometimes happens. I'm pretty sure his king just came up, and my king came back. Oh, here we go. King f4, king f7, king e4. My knight comes back to f5. He plays g3. Okay, here we go. I play my king over, and then he plays his knight in, and I'm just going to walk my king over to the king side and then advance the queen side pawns. So we don't have to go into how the rest of the game went, but I kind of advance the queen side pawns, and then I'm able to actually have my king infiltrate on the light squares. And so that gets rid of any plans he has for getting in on the king side, and then I end up, kind of threatening past pawns on both sides. So that was my game from yesterday, and it was a pretty clean victory for me. And I'm not only going to show my victories on here, I'm actually going to go back and make another video of the loss I had on Tuesday, and then I'll just try and do these for most of my games. So it just happened that this one was a win, a pretty clean win. And then we'll probably end up having an ugly loss next time that I'll show anyway, and talk about how bad I played. But, it goes both ways in chess. So hopefully you enjoyed this video and you learned something, and have a good day. Alright, signing off.